How did Glint come about, Linda?
I had been invited to participate in a workshop in Dresden, Germany, and I thought it would be wise and important to do a print project before. I was in New York. I had been introduced to Gregory Burnet, a master printer in New York, and I thought I would try working with Greg exceptionally. Change the venue. Usually I go to Copenhagen, as I'd done for years. So I went to Greg's studio on the west side in 23rd Street. There I saw that for the first time I would be working just with one printer, just him and me in the studio. It was very, very attractive. He then came to my studio to look at dry points, etchings, and woodcuts. It was my thought to make etchings, as I had done in the Footfall series, the previous one, but larger. So if there was anything like an idea, it was scale. And they would be etchings to keep some of the kind of beauty and spontaneity of the etched line, as opposed to the dry point line, which by definition is just a little bit more rigid, and I now have diagonals in the work and even curves sometimes. So that was the idea. And we set a date, and as ever, then there's a certain appropriate anxiety around the project. And Greg understood that the way I work is unusual. I need to turn the plate. That was fine, that was no problem. I explained to him that when I had done the Footfalls before, that was the first time in nearly over 20 years of printmaking that I actually had pounced through a drawing, deposited black dots on the ground plate, so I knew where I was going. That was a great gift for the Footfalls. He then said to me as I started out, you can actually use white transfer paper, Linda. And I said, oh boy, that's just fantastic. So I was able to do a drawing on paper exactly the size of the plate. We determined the plate on site. It's a question not of inches or centimeters, it's a question of intuitive reach. And that's how we, before long, didn't take long at all to get the size of this rather large plate. And that's a large plate for a print. So, okay, I did a drawing and I was happy with the first drawing, and I drew just as I would do in the studio. I was able then, with white transfer paper, to re-perform the drawing, the transfer paper between the grounded plate and my drawing, so I could see where I was going. And that was a great help, because it's difficult enough to get a very good line, too much to ask to also be sure that it's going to be a beautiful drawing, perfectly or well aligned on the plate. The other innovation, if you will, is that Greg realized that this is a very big plate, it's heavy, and that as I'm working, as you know, I'm on 1 foot in arabesque. There's a great deal of pressure on the plate, and he wanted to be sure that I wasn't worried that the plate would slip as I was drawing, because each line, as it happened, by necessity, my body insisted each line was carved 4 times. I went through once and twice, as I would do it in etching, and my body insisted on a 3rd and a 4th stroke. And as he watched me very discreetly, he said, let's tape the edges of the plate so it doesn't move, while I did each line. And I said, okay. Now that gave me great freedom to bring everything to bear, all my concentration, heart, body, mind, and soul on this line, once, twice, thrice, and a 4th stroke. And I did. So the notion of convergence is key here. You have to literally stay in this beautiful groove. And I noticed that after the second stroke, the glint of the copper plate shone through. I had now carved through the ground, and there was the glint. And if I could concentrate on the glint, that is what held me in pace and in place. Thus, the title of the series. Crucially, of course, with the corners now taped, every time I needed to make a new line, we needed to untape and retape. And we did. So by virtue of that, it slowed the whole process down and required a kind of patience, which is not my first nature, to be sure. And I don't have to bring that kind of patience to bear in the drawing, but I certainly have learned over the years in printmaking, it is a technique, and each of the techniques need to be respected. I mean, for example, with the drawing, it's absolutely direct. You see what you have. With a dry point, too, it's as direct as anything. You're carving into the copper plate, it's inked, it's printed. With an etching, it has to go into the acid, and the acid does the job. But here now it was going to be quite long. These are actually very long lines, each one carved 4 strokes, and then up goes the tape, turned 90 degrees, back goes the tape, and off I go. So in this way, Greg and I were working very much together. He's a very quiet Australian gentleman printer, very respectful. And when I asked him to say a few things about the way he works for my jotting, he said, well, people like what I do. And I know I liked very much what he did. He was, as he watched me, very sensitive to the way I draw. And crucially, he brought that to bear in the way he inked the plate. And was able, I think, because I watched him too, ink it in his own performative way, in his own meditative way. And I watched a few printers, and they do have their way. There's nothing frantic about it. And it's a touch. Just as my way of carving through is a very specific touch, and I say that having just made lithography, it's a very different touch. That's a light touch. This carved line of the glint it's a real incision. And that line is closer to the way that I draw. My drawn line is very incised, and it also takes on the need of convergence. In the drawing, it's down, up, and here it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, but slow, or you'll slip. So of course there were certain slippages, not too much. I mean, your heart skips a beat, of course, when it happens, and I will know right away if it's an okay slippage or if it's not. And in truth, I have learned that it's precisely those slippages that give the work its humanity. We rather love them, we welcome them, but we don't go for them. So, as I say, to carve each plate was quite a long process requiring absolute concentration through each line, the patience to turn it and retape. And so the first kinds of forms were the simplest ones, with just horizontal and vertical lines. And that was fine. Already the second one had this form slightly less complex, which was fine. It actually came from a different drawing, because I certainly know through experience that geometry is geometry, and if you want the intersections to cross, the proportions have to be right. So in just a taller kind of 16-part grid, it can be more figurative, less square, more of a rectangle. Once you are going to start with diagonals and crossing at intersections, the form has to shorten a bit. Otherwise, you won't cross properly. That is just how it works. So that was the second drawing. The third one, by necessity, following intuition, the play drive, if you will, became number 3. Again, 16 part, different, it's a new drawing. And then once again, the lozenge set in. The 5th, I knew what would it need to be. It would need to be more complex, and it was. And here I kind of outsmarted myself. It was complex, and there was more lines, and so rather like I do in a drawing, so as not to tape and untape and tape and untape, which seemed very tedious, I did 3 verticals, and then I turned. And this was the last day of our working, and I knew exactly what the form had to be. I intuited that form, there was no question. And I danced it out. I thought that was fine, that was graceful. Greg inked it, and it had no life. It was very anemic, is the only way to put it. And I thought, well, that's not all right. And I said, you know, I may really just blow it, but let me take that plate again and let me carve it again. So now each of those lines in Glint I-VII have been incised 8 strokes. And I thought probably that would be too heavy and it would not sit in the group, but I wasn't going to just throw it away. I just had to do it. Turns out it's very dynamic, and it's kind of a startler because they converge around a center, very like l'étoile. It's very, very kind of wow, but not too much. And I kept the possibility to just discard it, should it disturb. On the contrary, it calls you to attention and makes way for the number 6, which I'm looking at now, which has become a kind of another of the archetypes. That was number 6, which was nothing pushy, just right. And then there was to be a 7th, and I know that Greg expected that to be 1 degree more complex, and I knew that that was not what it was going to be. It became, on the contrary, a very simple lozenge, let's call it a lozenge or a diamond, with, as I really rather insist, the Greek cross, the diamond in the square. And that's what I wanted. That it succeeded meant that every line had to be very, very good. Nothing equivocal in that line. And I did it. And it felt fine to draw it. And when he printed it, it was exactly what I hoped for. And it made a really very beautiful, punchy end. Unexpected, but for me, just what I expected. And what I would say then, in the print shop, as we put up these 7 large sheets of paper, they didn't look like prints. I said, Greg, these aren't prints, they're things. And I love to use that word thing. It's a great friend of mine, David Wiggins, who's a philosopher, who many conversations over the years, very thoughtful about his use of words, and sometimes that's the only word that will do. It's a thing. So there are these 7 things held together by the Greek cross.
Did Greg come by recommendation, or through research?
No, highly recommended. His name was already much lauded in New York as long ago as 2005. I was very new to printmaking and new to everything, it seemed to me. And I was not really a New Yorker at all in those days. So I had no wish or need to hook up with a printmaker in New York. Actually, it was after that June in 2005 that I went to Copenhagen, then I think in late June for the first time to work with Niels Bohr Jensen. It was a great man. It's a great print shop. He I met when I was in Berlin, and he showed me prints that he had done with baselits, and I asked Niels if he would work with me, and he said yes. I told him about this turning business, and he said yes, he could manage that. So I worked with Niels almost every 2 years, 2005, 2007, and 9, and 11. I worked again another time in Italy. But there I was in New York, and I somehow was ready. I was introduced to Greg at the Met. There was some sort of reception within the Department of Prints and Drawings. The curator, Jennifer Farrell, introduced me, and I thought, all right, here I am, let me make prints with Greg. So as I say, it was each of these print shops has its virtues. They are all excellent in their ways. What was special here was just Greg and me. It's not the biggest print shop, but it's a hand press. He is just quietly a master printer. And that comes only with experience. It really is as intuitive and yet requires technical expertise. I mean, that's absolutely crucial. He knows exactly how many minutes that needs to sit in what kind of an acid to get the bite. And he was also able to realize right away that I had both the etched line as well as the dry point line, which gives you a burr, which is a kind of a line that you really like. It wears down after a few impressions. So we only have, this is a small edition of 10. He suggested that we plate it with some kind of plating, and I was horrified at the prospect. He said, no, it's fine, and then in the end he said, you know what, I think we won't. Electroplating or something like that, it keeps the plate stronger so that you can edition more, but I've never made large editions, and for me that's another layer of something else. And if anything, I like to be direct. For me, even printmaking is at a remove. So at a remove, that's not the good news. The good news is you get a very special line, which you don't get in a drawing. It's a very different line.
Take us to the studio.
Yes.
Do your best to describe the synergies working between you and Greg. It's collaborative.
Right.
And so
Yes.
I guess his presence would have got you on your toes as well.
On your toes, yeah. Well, I think there is always the sense when you're collaborating, there's more at stake. Someone has made their commitment, and I would absolutely match that commitment. Printmaking is something I welcome for many reasons, not the least of which it's a collaboration. And I find just as working with you, Ishmael, if I'm being filmed, you step up to the plate. Literally, you are that much more alert. You're being recorded. You're being watched. Something is being recorded. And so one's attention is that much better. It has to be. There's a lot at stake. Greg, I knew, was very, very discreetly, quietly observing, but very much out of the way. but nevertheless observing and taking it in. And I say that because his own, it seemed to me, way of inking the plate, the kind of rhythm that he brought to bear in taking it through the press. There's a particular moment where there's a different pressure, and there was nothing mechanical about it. Now, I suppose he does that most of the time. That's why he's a master printer. He's very, very good, but it was a discreet and quiet kind of collaboration. The great thing is there was a pret-a-manger on the corner in New York, and so I would get, so all these funny things that meant we could just get on with it, have just the little pause at the right time. The cups of tea were fine. They kept coming when they needed to, and then all of that, frankly, keeps you going through quite a long day. I arrived about 9:30 in the morning, and I left about 6, and you just keep going because you have a time slot, and that makes it appropriately stressful, so that you are on your toes. Just as you say, you're on your toes. It's a performance with a artifact. It's art, of course, but it was a strong performative element, of course. Greg was not so interested or keen to document it really at all, and that was just fine. I did want 1 or 2 pics maybe for my jotting, but never really came into it. They're there, but I don't even know really what happened. That was not his concern. He was there to help me realize the best prints I could. That's the mark of the master printer. He doesn't interfere artistically, but crucially, somebody like Greg, somebody like Niels, is also crucial in judgment. And that's very important. Then you know you're working also with an artist, judging the quality of the line, and crucially in a print, judging plate tone. Because we are after something here of beauty and something that will have just the right aesthetic impact. That's judgment. It's a very, very finely judged way of determining how much plate tone. If it's wiped too clean, it's too clinical, and that's not what you want. On the other hand, too much is gray and much too painterly for my aesthetic. Just enough to somehow give a little bit of weight to these otherwise white areas. After all, this is a big plate with not very many lines. I mean, it needs to be activated to a certain extent. You know just when it's enough. So my job is the drawing, but then his job is absolutely the right amount of ink. In that black, he probably adds just a little bit of red to make it a warmer black. That's also a key judgment for the master printer. And then how much to wipe that plate clean. Very interesting to watch the master printer wipe that away. And it's also a very performative thing. The different materials they use. I wouldn't want to do that part of it at all. It's, for me, it is the technical side, and I leave that to the master printer.
You're calling the 7 panels of Glint things.
Yes.
Gives a strong sense of significance. How central is Glint, therefore, to your practice today?
Very central. You will know, of course, Victor Skip, the great collector. Writing about my work, he said that the works were like a found object. And that's really important to me. It should look like it has literally been found, almost in the case of archaeology. as if I didn't make it, as it were. It just always existed. And that is the kind of presence that I think each of these glints has. Taken together, they read to me as a Greek frieze. I insist that they're figures. They are figures. And what was very striking to see them lined up on the wall was that what held them together, what gave them an absolute sense of frieze-like coherence, was the Greek cross and where it fell on the sheet. For a piece like this, I mean, it's very precise. Sometimes the cross is open. Sometimes that center is open. But the Greek cross, it's not the Christian cross. It's more central, and yet it's a figure. I look for them in all those encyclopedic museums. I look for it in the Met. I look for it in the British Museum. I look for it in the Neues Museum in Berlin. I look for my drawings. Often they're in stone, but they're there, and that's what I saw. Sometimes a 16-part segment, sometimes the lozenge, sometimes the center is open. And it just moved along as it should. It didn't have to be determined, it's not determined, except by virtue of my intuition bringing forth exactly what my eye desires to receive. So that's how they unfold when seen in a line.
Soon after Glint, you went to Berlin to work in wood.
Yes.
Can one presume that Glint had established a new impetus in your work?
Well, almost inadvertently, yes. Now, since I made these dry point etchings with Greg, I went off to Dresden and I made my colored woodcut, double yellow drive, and on this large, almost life-size piece of wood, once I had drawn my drawing again and again, and it was very much indented, I could not bring myself to carve that line or to gouge it. That was very anti-graceful and really goes against my grain, much less the grain of the wood. And so, intuitively, I picked up a diamond, a dry point tool, and I carved that piece of wood with a dry point. So if these are dry point etchings, I now had a dry point woodcut. And that is a very cool white line. It's very delicate, but each line was probably carved 8 times. I mean, I just carved it till I knew that was enough. And I had nothing to lose. It's either going to work or it's not. It was inked, it was printed, and it was somehow a wow. So that was shown right away. I obviously keep in my body and my mind, I hold on to the experience of the glint, and surely I brought that to bear, especially on the large piece of wood. And so it's worth repeating. If these are a dry point etching, that's a dry point woodcut, which already says something about my need to carve it again and again. My absolute compulsion, if you will, to inscribe that line. Now, in this particular print shop in Germany, they are also master printos of the lithographic stone. And that is something, again, I've always steered quite far away from the litho, not really understanding it, thinking that's for painters, that's for some sort of expressive thing on that stone, not for me, thank you very much. Well, I was wrong, and I had nothing to lose by taking up the challenge, and I was very, very interested in these 50-million-year-old stones, of which there are many. And I very quickly realized, and I've just come back from taking it on quite seriously, this is an age-old, well, it was only invented in 1796, but you're working on stones, and so, as Elizabeth Palmer has said, with great understanding, with lithography, it's a bloodline from hand to stone to hand. And within those stones, and in Dresden, you can take apart the layers, you see the bloodline. And so, to print that stone, the printer educates the stone to hold on to the drawing. And a film has been made about that, and it's magic. The stone learns what to print and what not to print. That master printer knows when the stone is ready, washes the drawing off, inks the plate, and the drawing reappears. So with that kind of respect in mind, then I could take my position with my specially created turntable to move the stone with grace, standing on my palette stage so that I'm tall enough, and I could then, respecting this new technique, move with a much lighter touch. The litho crayon is a lot softer than I'm used to drawing. There's no point in pushing hard, it'll break right under you, and it broke quite a lot for me at first, until you get the feel of that too. And while I am anything but expert, nevertheless, I was able to bring to bear all that I could, and I think draw a very beautiful drawing which could not be more of an archetype. It's a 16-part form again.
You talked about recognizing Glint after you'd created it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that had come from a pre-existing station, as
Yes.
it were. That seems to suggest a state of immanence. Were you surprised by this?
Thrilled, yes. As I say, that's the forms, of course, are my forms, and while I recognize the form, what's startling is the quality of that line. And that can only happen in that kind of a print. And I say that kind of a print, I don't know another print like that. I don't know about a dry point etching. So I think Greg was surprised too. And that was very exciting. I mean, he has done a lot of amazing prints with a lot of very, very, very extraordinary artists. But the fact that so few lines can give that sort of an aesthetic impact is kind of thrilling. And I've seen people's reaction to it, and it's pretty thrilling.
You know, when I look at these 7 pieces, they look like a procession.
Yes, absolutely a procession of these figures. These, it makes me think of that all the time, and I love that about it.
What is this series telling you about your work, about your history, about the future of your practice? What have you revealed?
I just think it proves, shows, confirms, if you will, that intuitively I will bring into being a natural progression. There's no question as to what should come next. I just know for me what should come next. And I don't doubt it when I see it.